The opening bars of Saint-Saëns's Study in the Form of a Waltz, a recording Magda Tagliaferro made a few months before her 80th birthday, with no diminution that I can hear in her technical skill or her powers of characterization. Magdalena Tagliaferro was born at Petropolis in Brazil in January 1893. Her father, Paolo, himself half Italian and half Alsatian, had been born in Paris and had enlisted voluntarily in the Franco-Prussian War. He then studied the piano with Raoul Pugno before being sent off to South America by the French government to exercise his real profession of civil engineer. Madame Tagliaferro remembers her father with the greatest admiration and affection, and it was partly through his musical contacts that she came to Paris at the age of 13 to try for the Conservatoire, although obviously she, like anyone else, had to pass the entrance exam. Among the jury were Gabriel Fauré, the director, and the famous pianist Moritz Moszkowski, who muttered to Fauré the prescient opinion that this little one ought to play well, as she keeps her eyes open, which I take to have applied both literally and metaphorically. Madame Tagliaferro is not a swooning pianist, the sort you see imitated in Hollywood movies. And metaphorically speaking, she's always remained open to any influences that she felt might be useful to her. Moszkowski's forecast was soon realized. The young Magda entered the class of Antonin Marmontel, who had also been Marguerite Long's teacher, and after just 1 year was awarded the top first prize in the ladies' piano competition. The critic of Le Ménestrel, while admitting it was not one of the strongest fields he'd heard, singled out Magda Tagliaferro as a délicieuse enfant of quite exceptional talent. Is it possible, he asked, that she has no more to learn? Well, of course, at 14 she had a great deal to learn. But for me, listening to recordings she's made over a period of 50 years, as well as to 2 recent live recitals in London, what is most striking of all is the combination of energy and authority in her playing. Her entrance onto the stage is made without fuss, calm, upright, even a little severe. The whole business of approaching the piano, settling onto the stool, preparing to play, there's a natural timing about it all. And as with her performances, she has the air of being able to bend time to her will. Nothing is ever hurried, and if a composer gives even a hint of aiming at something grand and spacious, he can be sure that Madame Tagliaferro will take that hint. you didn't know that work, you might have thought it was an undiscovered concerto by Brahms, such is the grandeur Madame Tagliaferro gives to that D minor theme. In fact, like my first extract, it's by Saint-Saëns, from the first movement of his fifth concerto, and I think it gives a good idea of the variety and scope of her playing, from dramatic pathos to the wonderful lightness and agility of those scales, the jeu perlé of the old French tradition. Shortly after she won her first prize in 1907, her teacher Marmontel died, and his place was taken by Alfred Cortot. She remained in the class and had the incalculable benefits of Cortot's teaching in the days when he was primarily a concert pianist and before he became an organizer. The essential characteristic, she wrote, of Cortot's teaching was to lead us to discover new horizons that we had never guessed at. He was always intent on discovering the right color for a work, as well as the right tempo. And as we shall hear, tempo and color have remained two of Madame Tagliaferro's own preoccupations. Cortot, as it happened, was interested in more than her pianistic ability. On several occasions he made to her what she describes as a surprising declaration, to which she did not feel like responding. He then had the idea of marrying her off to Pablo Casals. The famous Cortot-Thibault-Casals trio was then in its heyday, so he thought this way he'd still be able to see her. But Madame Tagliaferro called a halt when Casals declared that, like Johann Sebastian Bach, he wanted to have 20 children. In the end, she became more like the trio's adopted sister, though as a pianist there was no way in which she could take part in their public concerts. Away from music, she made up a foursome for tennis, which they were all keen on, and she remembers defeating Cortot with her service and being treated to a long analysis of why he'd failed to get it back. Passionate commitment, rigorous analysis, these were the attitudes Cortot promoted, attitudes which marked Madame Tagliaferro for life. They excluded anything that smacked of sentimentality. And here we come back to the question of tempo. Of course, a certain surface flexibility is in order, but below that a pianist has to keep a firm pulse going, otherwise the work's unity and balance are endangered. Madame Tagliaferro speaks sharply of slap-happy young virtuosi of today who have only a relative interest in tempo. We can hear something of her classical approach to this question in her recording of the idyll from Chabrier's 10 characteristic pieces. Chabrier does actually write "Don't slow down" and "absolutely in time" over those final bars, but how rarely you hear them played that way. Elsewhere, the nuances of rubato and dynamics in Magda Tagliaferro's playing make all the greater effect, I feel, for the plain, rhythmic background against which they occur. Her concert career began the year after she won her first prize at the Conservatoire, when Fauré took her with him on a tour through France. She would play some of his solo pieces, and the concerts would end with his ballade, Fauré playing the orchestral accompaniment on a second piano. From here on, she was much in demand, both in France and abroad. She accompanied Enesco and Thibault, and played concertos under Munch, Stokowski, and Furtwängler. It speaks more than little for her charm that when she was playing the last movement of the Schumann concerto under Furtwängler, she introduced on the spur of the moment one of her personal nuances. She was afraid she might have lost contact with the orchestra and glanced nervously over to the podium, to be rewarded with a conspiratorial wink. Paris remained her base through the 1920s and 30s, and in 1928 she was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, at 35 the youngest woman ever to receive the decoration. In 1937 she was given a piano class at the Paris Conservatoire, and in the competition at the end of the academic year, every one of her pupils gained a prize of some sort, 4 of them first prizes. But then the war came. At the time she was on tour in the United States. She made every possible effort to come back to France, but when, after many months, she did manage to get a reply from the French ambassador in Washington, it was to say, "Of course you can go back to France, as long as you don't mind playing for the Germans." When she did return after the war, she resumed her teaching in private, founding her own international piano academy. She also began the pattern of dividing her year between Paris and South America. Obviously, in a concert career spanning nearly 80 years, she'd met many remarkable people. But of all those she came to know well, probably there was no one with whom she was more in sympathy than the composer Ronaldo Hahn. He too had been born in South America, and had come to Paris in his youth. Madame Tagliaferro was his favourite pianist, and in the early 1930s he wrote a concerto for her, though without bothering overmuch about the smallness of her hands. But she overcame her worries on that score, and gave the first performance with the composer conducting. She's never really enjoyed the atmosphere of the recording studio, but shortly afterwards Hahn did prevail on her to commit her performance to disc. the central movement of Ronaldo Hahn's Piano Concerto, Madame Tagliaferro's favourite among the records she's made. Her repertoire's a large one. She's not in favour of specialisation, believing that a real musician ought to be able to tackle everything. Hands permitting, that is. She regrets that the smallness of her hands has precluded playing the Liszt sonata, which temperamentally would be perfect for her. There's also the danger with small hands, as she says, of wanting to produce more volume than you can, and so being tempted into a dry, hard sound, so eloquently evoked by the French word taper. Probably for this reason, she prefers Steinways with their carrying power and prolonged resonance to Bösendorfers, and likewise among old French pianos, she preferred Pleyel's to Erard's, which she found rather metallic. Her style and technique are very much her own. In both respects, she learned a lot after winning her first prize. Or, to be precise, she taught herself a lot. The critical habits instilled by Cortot led her to question continually her way of doing things. When, after the Second World War, she came back from her first stint on the jury of the Warsaw Chopin competition, her only thought was to go through all Chopin's works again, because so many new ideas had come her way from the competitors, keeping her eyes and ears open once again. 3 points above all distinguish her technique. She sits quite high on the piano stool, so the strength of her whole body is concentrated on the ends of her fingers, with the arch under the knuckles kept absolutely firm. She plays, as she says, on the level of the black notes, and she waxes passionate about the need to keep the elbow free. Not that she claims to have invented the elbow, but keeping it pinned to the side leads to tight playing, and to inaccuracy at the extremities of the keyboard, as in Cortot's case. Her concern for colour has always been in evidence whatever she played, but I think it comes across most strongly in Spanish and South American music. Here, for example, in Triana from Albéniz Suite Iberia, it's intimately linked with her treatment of the left hand, so often neglected in her view at the expense of the right. like all fine pianists, Magda Tagliaferro has the ability to surprise an audience, to make them see the logic of her interpretation only in retrospect. She has a taste for springing surprises in real life, too. In 1927, a French newspaper editor asked a number of pianists for their views on the question, does modern music, modern French music that is, demand greater strength than classical music? His expectation of the answer yes was satisfied by most contributors, but not by Madame Tagliaferro, who claimed, and still claims, that the music of the Impressionists asks for qualities of colour and above all of tenderness, but that classical music is physically more demanding to play because of the control you have to exercise. I feel this tension is already in Madame Tagliaferro herself, a large spirit in a small body, the subdued romanticism which, according to André Gide, is the essence of classicism. A perfect illustration of this is her recording, under Ronaldo Hahn, of Mozart's Coronation Concerto K537. It allows one to understand, for one thing, why, when occupying troops at the end of the last war wrecked her country house near Fontainebleau, the only thing they didn't touch was her portrait hanging over the mantelpiece, a triumph of character over the baser instincts. And I think we can also hear the workings of an active, inquiring intelligence. As Madame Tagliaferro says, there are more secrets in music than people think.